Welcome to the Tournament Poker Edge podcast, brought to you by TournamentPokerEdge.com, the only podcast dedicated exclusively to poker tournament strategy. Now here's your host, Clayton Fletcher.
Hello once again, everybody, and welcome to the Tournament Poker Edge podcast. I'm your host, Clayton Fletcher, here in Las Vegas, where I'm absolutely surrounded by poker players at every turn, and yet my guest today is 3,000 miles away in Atlantic City. He's going to be
also surrounded by poker players.
Also surrounded by poker players, but you don't want to talk to any of the people that are around you, and I don't want to talk to anybody who's around me, so it's you and me, coast to coast. He is the author of Play Optimal Poker. He's also someone with whom I've been obsessed with many years. You guys know this person, Andrew Brokos. How are you, Andrew?
Oh, I'm good. Like you said, there's not a lot of poker players that I like to talk to, but the ones I do like to talk to, I like to talk to very much. And you're in the latter group, so it's good to talk to you.
Thank you. It's a huge compliment. I want to clarify what I meant by obsessed. You know that I used to listen to your podcast well before we ever met. And I actually went on somebody else's non-poker podcast and mentioned your podcast. And that's how you and I first became friends. I don't know if we ever told that story.
How's our podcast getting plugged on a comedy podcast?
Yeah, well, I think the guy just asked me what I do in my free time. And I told him I listen religiously to the Thinking Poker podcast, which, by the way, if there's anyone listening to this that's not also a subscriber to that, you should be. And also follow Andrew on Twitter at Thinking Poker, not at Clayton Comic. That's me. Every time I say Twitter, the next thing out of my mouth is at Clayton Comic. That's just a reflex at this point.
Yeah, I'm sure you have a lot of experience delivering.
Yeah, but follow Andrew at Thinking Poker. I know you guys just released a new episode of your podcast where Nate is back on the airwaves, and everybody missed hearing from him. So that was a really enjoyable episode.
Good. I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, we've kind of fallen behind a little bit with sort of the holidays and my travel. Nate's got a job and a kid now. It's getting harder and harder to schedule these things. So I think we're going to get back into the swing of it pretty soon. I do have a lot of people lined up that I want to talk to. It's just been a little tricky, especially around the holidays. But so yeah, we've slowed down a bit. But the ones that we put out recently were good. Like you said, there's the one with Nate, and then I got to record one. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this show will know Carlos Welch. So I went to Cherokee, North Carolina, nominally to play the WSOP circuit event down there, but really goal number one was hang out with Carlos because he was going to be there. And so I got to sit down with him in person, which is a rare treat, and record with him. So yeah, there's at least one really good episode has come out in the last month.
Yeah, well, Carlos is no stranger to TPE, of course. Everybody knows and loves him. He's one of the people that you would go to North Carolina just because he's close. That's close enough to go visit Carlos. And if there happens to be a poker tournament as well, that's just a bonus.
Right, yeah, and that really is the order of priorities there. Like, I mean, I can play poker in Maryland where I was. The poker was a touch better in North Carolina, not really, 8-hour drive and a week's worth of hotel better, but mix in Carlos and then snap call, I'm going to North Carolina.
Absolutely. And it sounded like you guys had a good time down there.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. The tournament was kind of frustrating, but I mean, I think it's stupid to complain about tournaments being frustrating because that's literally what they are. They're just frustration machines. So to play a tournament and then be like, oh, I had a frustrating result. I don't know, don't play a tournament if you don't want a frustrating result.
No, that's a really healthy attitude. Anytime I see a long line of people waiting to register for a tournament, I'm like, oh, is this the line for torture?
Yeah.
Is this where I stand if I'm a masochist and I want to be tortured?
It's literally just you keep increasing the stakes until either you make a mistake or something unlucky happens to you, or once in a blue moon you actually win the thing. But most of the time the outcome is either you do something stupid that costs you chips, and or you get unlucky in a way that costs you. Like one of those things is almost guaranteed to happen. Like the only other alternative is that you win the tournament, and we know how rarely that happens. So like it's basically a guarantee that either you're going to screw up or you're going to get unlucky.
Yeah, well, pretty much. And something we've been discussing a lot on this podcast is the importance of setting goals that are things you can actually control. So maybe like rather than I want to win 3 bracelets this year or make $400,000 or whatever kind of goals you might want to set for yourself. As a tournament player, I think it's better to just think about what you can control. Like I'm going to make sure that I always get 8 hours sleep before I play a tournament, or I want to only play when I'm feeling my best, or something like that, or volume goals you could have. Like I want to make sure I play X number of tournaments. Like my magic number this year is 42. I don't know how I came up with that number, but it's kind of the average of the number of tournaments that I'll play. I'm talking about live tournaments, of course, that I'll play on years when I've done well. And it seems to me like if I play fewer than that, then I don't have enough of a sample. So I feel like I want to play 42 and I want to play them really well. And I've even told the listeners, like if I wake up one day and I'm in a bad mood, like if I'm on my way to the poker tournament and I'm already feeling grouchy or people are getting on my nerves, just, in line for coffee, I'm not going to play, because those are the days when I'm more prone to tilt. And it's usually related to how much sleep I get, especially when I travel across time zones, as I have in this trip. As I mentioned, I'm in Las Vegas, but everybody knows I live in New York. I actually sat out one of the tournaments I wanted to play because I just didn't get enough sleep and I didn't feel like I would play my best. And maybe your B game is good enough to win, but mine isn't.
It's not good enough to I don't. It's very rare that I would go like knowing that I'm likely to play my B game. Like your edge is certainly very diminished. Even if you still have an edge, it's rarely going to be like a good hourly to be playing if you know you're going to be playing your B game.
So are you like me? Do you like to set goals at the beginning of a new year, and do you try to make them things you can control?
I'm definitely on board with the things you control. I've gotten a lot less formal over the years with actual goal setting, probably more out of laziness than some sort of principled reason for not doing it. I couldn't honestly tell you that I've set very clear goals for this year, but I do think it's silly to have both like yearly goals and in terms of like a specific tournament or something. You'll sometimes hear people say like, my goal is to have 100 big blinds at the end of every level or something like that. So, okay, why not 300 big blinds? Like, why not my goal is to win the tournament in level 1? Like, that's all. Like, that stuff is so far beyond your control, and I feel like it can only lead you to make mistakes. Where like if you have you don't have your magic 100 big blinds at the end of a level, and then you decide you're going to open a hand that you wouldn't ordinarily open. Like you should already be playing your best. So the only thing that goal could lead you to do would be to do something that you wouldn't otherwise do, or not do something that you should do just because you already have your 100 big blinds. So you're like, oh, I just won't 3-bet this hand, even though it's a hand you should 3-bet. I think another one could be, and this doesn't have to be as years time span, but just when you're playing a particular tournament, to have in mind a particular skill that you want to focus on. And this could be related to a video that you watched recently on Tournament Poker Edge. So it could be, I want to work on making sure that I'm always thinking about bluffing. So not that you should be, bluffing anywhere near every time you have the opportunity to do so, but that you're always considering, is this a situation where I should bluff? The combination of the information I have about my opponent's hand plus the whatever value my cards provide, whether they give you equity or they're blockers, or whether the totality of the situation inclines itself towards a bluff, rather than simply saying, oh, I have nothing, I fold, or I have nothing, I check, or I think I have some showdown value, I check. Like I think a reasonable goal could be always consider bluffing or never miss a value bet. I think goals like those are going to help you to focus on one particular skill, and I think that's much more useful than a goal like play better.
Yeah, no, I think that's a lot more concrete than just, I want to make sure I play my A game. This is something that I'm working on, and I want to, like a lot of people have something that they're studying a video, like, 3-betting strategies or whatever, and then they want to try to incorporate those strategies into the next time they play. Even if you try something you're uncomfortable trying once or twice in the tournament, I think that's good, because that's how we grow and that's how we learn. I mean, you can't let the results teach you something, because the results could be good or bad, even if the play wasn't good or bad, right? We all know that. But yeah, just maybe trying to experiment with putting more tools in your bag. Or, last week on this podcast, I talked about something that I call the big squeeze, which is when several players have already entered the pot, but now the pot is so big compared to your stack that shoving with a really wide range could actually be profitable. Like for example, in the main event with 70 players left, it was a raise and then 3 or 4 callers, and this guy just goes all in with queen nine, which feels like a kamikaze mission, but his M was 8 and he had his reasons. My point was that this particular play in certain circumstances is very profitable.
Yeah, I mean, but it could even be a situation where you could be sure you're going to get called, but if you can make 3 of those players fold and then you just race queen nine suited heads up against a single hand, like even if you are up against ace king or pocket tens or some hand that you're going to have decent equity, and if you've trapped that much dead money in the pot, I think a lot of people are too wrapped up in I guess essentially survival, wanting to survive at all costs, or wanting to. I think a lot of people are too concerned about what are the cards that they're holding when they get eliminated. They're like, oh, I don't want to go out shoving queen nine suited. So I mean, if it's plus EV, it's plus EV. I think it's hard enough to find plus EV spots without getting starting to turn your nose up at certain ones and say, well, I want EV, but not with queen nine suited.
Yeah, right.
You got to take it where you can get it.
By the way, last week I forgot to mention what hands folded. The original raiser had pocket deuces, which he raised under the gun, which I know you would not have been a fan of that decision in the first place. Alex Foxen called in second position with ace queen offsuit, and another player folded pocket sixes. So this big squeeze gets through, and the guy increases his stack by almost 50%. So yeah, I mean, shoving for twice the pot or 3 times the pot. And if you're going to get hands that strong to fold, like especially the ace queen, I introduced this concept that I think a lot of players, they would of course shove with ace king in that spot. But I think even when you shove with ace king, you don't really want to get called, especially.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
And I think that's good to recognize that like queen nine suited is really of the same sort. You're kind of looking for the same, or you're shoving it for the same reason you're shoving ace king, which is like, it would be nice if everyone folded, but even if they don't, I'm still going to have a fighting chance if I'm called. Obviously your chance is a little bit better with ace king. There's a chance you might actually get called by a hand that's worse than yours, but at the end of the day, it's just equity is equity. And EV that comes from sucking out is worth just as much as EV that comes from getting in ahead and holding.
Well, one thing I always like to say is you're never drawing dead before the flop. So.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's part of why you can make a big shot, in a way that it's rarely correct to be jamming like 3 times the pot after the flop. But before the flop, it's quite common that, it would be correct to jam that much. And that's because you're not, like after the flop, when you jam so much, you tend to restrict your opponents to calling with only extremely strong hands, and then you're often in very bad shape against extremely strong hands after the flop. But before the flop, even getting it in against you're in pretty bad shape if your opponent has a pair that's bigger than both of your cards. But other than that, like if you get it in, even against a hand that dominates you, queen nine suited against ace queen, your equity isn't completely atrocious. I mean, it's not nearly as bad as getting it in with like 2 overcards versus a set or something after the flop. It's just like it's pretty hard to be in really, really bad shape pre-flop, which is part of why you can stick a lot more money in pre-flop than you can post-flop with the hands that are kind of ugly.
Yeah, and then the other considerations for me are, obviously my relationship between my stack and the pot is absolutely important here, because the math works out that you only need to win the hand like 65% of the time or whatever in order to show a profit. And then also, I think for me, and you can tell me if this is flawed thinking or not, in your opinion, I look at whether my stack is average or well below average, and I'm more likely to make this kind of play if I'm not really contending for the title in the first place.
There's a lot going on in that question, I think. For one thing, this situation is unlikely to come up if you have a big stack. Like part of why you can get away with this, or part of why it's easier to make this play when you're short, is that you're guaranteed to realize all your equity when you get all in. Whereas if you were to make the same play when everyone has 200 big blinds and it's like open to 3, call, you make it 18. Now someone can still 3-bet you to like 40 something, and then you have to fold your queen nine suited. So like you're not guaranteed to realize your equity. Like even if they have the same, even if they have ace king, for instance, you get 0% equity because you fold to a 4-bet. Whereas if you can just shove and get it all in, then you're guaranteed to realize your like 38% or whatever you have against ace king, 40% equity. Like you're going to realize all of that because you get it all in. So like that's like the power of being a short stack, is that being able to move all in is a very powerful play. So I think like this, you're more likely to be considering this when you are short stacked. When it comes to like jeopardizing what would otherwise be like, let's suppose it is an average stack. I mean, maybe this is a turbo tournament where like a 20 big blind stack actually is average.
Yeah, it's the Colossus or something. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the action is like min raise, call, and like you just jamming an average stack right now. I mean, you should have a little bit of risk aversion towards a play that could potentially get you eliminated. That's just sort of the nature of tournaments. And then the more that you think you have an edge over the field, the more that should factor into your being like extra risk averse. But there's like, so I mean, it's true that you should sacrifice some EV in the interest of survival, but it's important to recognize first like how plus EV is the situation. I think what a lot of people do is they take a kind of lazy or even cowardly shortcut where they just kind of say, well, you know, I could get eliminated in this situation, or there's a fair chance I'll get eliminated in this situation, and it's important to value survival in a tournament, so I just won't do it. And they never actually consider, well, just how plus EV is this? Because you know, if it's sufficiently plus EV, then you should be willing to jeopardize your tournament life, or to jeopardize a healthy stack or a big stack or something like that. And if you're not one of the better players in the tournament, which, you know, it's good to try to be honest about these things, then you should be more likely to take risks. Like that's the flip side of, you know, if you're one of the better players, you should be risk averse. If you're one of the weaker players, you should be trying to get it all in pre-flop and get lucky, because the alternative is, you know, if you're playing like small pots, then you're giving your superior opponents, your more skilled opponents, more opportunities to outplay you after the flop. Whereas, you know, just getting it all in pre-flop, you can't get outplayed too badly.
Yeah, that was actually the third factor that I wanted to mention that might influence my decision whether or not to make a play like this, and that is the skill disadvantage I might perceive myself to have. If I'm in a really tough table, like if I had been at this table, I mean, this table was tough. There was Alex Foxen, you know, GPI Player of the Year. Also, Yuri Sivileski, who just wins everything he plays, it seems like. If I had been unfortunate enough to be at that table in the main event, I might be a little bit more likely to take some variance. I'm unlikely to outplay both of those guys. Of course, I have other players that I think I would have a skill edge over. Kind of your relationship skill-wise to the field is very important to be able to assess in a honest way, and I just don't know how many players can actually do that, because most of us think we're the best who ever lived.
Yeah, I do think that's true. I don't want to harp too much on that, because I think the most important point is like there are times where it's correct to risk your survival in the tournament, or to find yourself in a situation where you're going to have a very short stack if something that you attempt doesn't work out, if the reward is there. Like I think a lot of people just, you know, try to shortcut around the risk versus reward equation, or you know, doing that work, and instead just say, well, there's risk, so I won't do it. It's like, you already entered a poker tournament, like you signed up for risk. Now it's just a question of pricing that risk. And I think if you don't bother to put a price on it, and you just say, well, I don't want to get eliminated in this situation, then, you know, I think there's a lot of ways to miss EV. So I don't want to lean too much. I mean, everything you said is true. I just don't want to lean, like I don't want to miss the forest for the trees, or, you know, to give people too many excuses towards what I think a lot of people are already naturally inclined towards, which is being excessively risk averse in these kinds of situations.
Yeah, I mean, people will say, well, I think it's a coin flip, but I'm just going to fold. I hear that all the time at the table. I'll wait for a better spot. I don't want to flip. But there's already all this dead money in the pot. It's almost definitely a mistake. If you're sure it's a flip, you should flip.
And like, how do you know it's a flip? Like, I think, you know, people fold ace king in this situation. They're like, I don't want to flip. It's like, how do you know it's a flip? How do you know the guy didn't have ace queen? You know, like, it's,
right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that's.
Yeah. So, thanks for talking through that with me. I did that episode solo last week, because I've been doing a lot of these solo. And as you know, from talking to yourself into a microphone, it's much more fun to have someone to bounce ideas off of. So It was nice to kind of go back and rewind, especially because I forgot to mention the outcome of that hand last week for those that didn't get to see it on Poker Go. was that the squeeze gets through, and those are the hands that folded. Deuces, ace, queen, and sixes all went away. So anyway, I love your book. I mentioned your book many times on the podcast. The way that you take relatively complex and for some people scary topics like equilibrium and just game theory in general is not something that everyone is comfortable getting into, and it's hard for somebody to read like a textbook, like a calculus textbook, like a game theory, like if you want to get a doctorate degree in game theory or something, is how some of the other literature has been written. Yours is so much more accessible. From reading that book, just your teaching style is so clear, and I feel like for me it clarified a lot of things that I thought I already understood, but I found out from reading your book that I actually had them wrong. So what kind of feedback have you been getting on the book, and how is it doing in general?
Well, let me say first, thank you for that. I mean, those were definitely my goals for the book, but it's impossible to be objective about those things. So it's very nice to hear someone of your caliber say exactly that about the book, because that really was what I was aiming for. It's been doing quite well. I mean, it surpassed my expectations, and it helped that it occurred to me. I guess I haven't been on the show since this happened. I did pretty well in the main event this year, and that definitely helped with book sales. And Jamie Kerstetter was kind enough to mention the book on ESPN, like during the ESPN broadcast. So there was like a pretty noticeable spike. I can like see my day-by-day sales on Amazon, and there's like a clear spike on the day that the book gets mentioned on ESPN, which is pretty cool. So the book definitely exceeded. I mean, I really didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what other poker book authors had sold, or I didn't have even a strong sense of what I could expect to sell or what I should expect to sell. At this point, 7 months or something after the book came out, and I'm still getting a decent number of sales. I really had no idea what to expect in terms of any of that, but it did well enough that I'm working on a sequel now. In fact, I started working on it almost immediately when I left Las Vegas.
What can you tell us about the sequel without revealing anything you're not supposed to reveal?
Well, the nice thing about self-publishing is there's not really anything I'm not supposed to reveal. I can, can do whatever the hell I want. So I'm trying to take into account both what I see as, I don't want to say shortcomings, because I mean it's kind of inevitable. Like, you can't do everything in a book, but like what I feel like was missing, or is like a logical next step from the previous book, and then also incorporate feedback from readers and people saying, here's what I liked about the book, and here's what I wish had been in there, and that kind of thing. So the first book was heavy on toy games, like the Ace King Queen game, for instance. This sort of I think they're similar to poker. They have like a betting structure similar to poker, but they're not actual poker examples. And the idea was to try to use these like simplified toy games to tease out concepts about poker strategy that are applicable in real poker situations. And I think just in terms of the audience, different people have different levels of comfort with doing that kind of extrapolation. I think some people are capable of looking at a kind of theoretical result and then saying, oh, okay, I understand how that would apply in an actual poker situation where I had two cards instead of just an ace or a king or a queen. But I think for other people, that's like a daunting thing to do. So one of the biggest pieces of feedback I got was just people wanted more real Hold'em examples, more Pio Solver sort of analysis, and less toy games. So that's one big thing that I'm doing, is just in order to even to make the same kinds of points, I'm trying to use more like actual Hold'em examples rather than toy games. The Ace King Queen game appears once in this new book, as we're looking at playing it across multiple streets. Other than that, that's the only toy game that's in the entire book. And the focus in general is on multi-street play and on early street play. So a lot of the original Play Optimal Poker book, the first book, is about polarized versus condensed situations where one person is betting and that player is going to have either a very strong or a very weak hand, and then the other player facing a bet has what we might call a condensed range or a bluff catcher, the kind of thing where they can beat a bluff, but they're going to lose to a value hand. And then, so Play Optimal Poker was very much about how to play those kinds of situations. And those can occur at any point in a Hold'em hand, but like we were saying, before the flop, it's hard to be in really bad shape. And the same is actually true on the flop. I mean, it's possible to be in really bad shape, but there's reasons on the flop why you might bet other than just strictly as a value bet or as a bluff, right? Sometimes you're betting the flop partly for protection, because hand equities can change from street to street. Now, on the river, that doesn't happen. On the river, ranges are perfectly polarized. You either have a good hand or you don't. But on earlier streets, that's not always true. And then you have to take into factors like board coverage, understanding, well, the turn might be a third flush card and I have to be prepared for that possibility, or the turn might be an ace and I have to be prepared for that possibility, or the turn might be an ace that is also the third flush card and I have to be prepared for that possibility. So this book is a lot about range building, especially on earlier streets, and how do you take all these considerations, or all these things into consideration, take into account board coverage, take into account your interest in denying equity to your opponent, but also not wanting to put yourself in a situation where your opponent can deny equity to you, for example, by check raising. So there's a lot to balance on these early streets, and I'm trying to write about it in a clear way to help people figure out how do they determine what are the really important things to be thinking about, and then how do they actually work through those factors once they've identified the factors that they should be considering.
See, the thing is, when I read your books or anything that you do for TPE, that's what I meant earlier, by the way, when I said I'm obsessed with you. Everything that you put out, I'm consuming. So I didn't mean that any other way it could be taken. It's just that I'm a major fan and a big time consumer of all of your work. The way that you describe things, to me, it's interesting. It just proves that education is tricky, because there are different ways to teach the same thing and there are different ways to learn the same thing. I find the toy game examples incredibly helpful. They clarify for me things that I didn't see. It's interesting hearing that you got feedback that people wanted more actual hold'em hands, because I think that taking an analogous example is actually a clearer way to explain it, rather than say, okay, so you have ace queen, right? So I guess everybody's different. And as a teacher, and I think when you write a book, you're basically assuming the role of teacher, instructor. It's not a classroom, but you have a lot of students that are listening to what you're saying. I think when you do that, you have to take into account that not everyone learns in the same way.
Yeah, that's right. And I try to, I have my, it's funny, like using that analogy of being a teacher, like even to think about what does that mean to be a teacher. I think people have different ideas about that, about how authoritative a teacher should be. Like, is a teacher's job to say, well, I know what's best for you, and it's toy game. Like, maybe you don't like doing toy games, but like, hey, if you want to get better at poker, like, you got to do your homework, kid.
Suck it up and deal.
Yeah. Or you're supposed to sort of meet the student where they are and say, okay, I need to find a way to communicate these concepts to you in the way that works for you. And maybe it's not the way, like maybe the reason I think toy games are best is because my brain works a little bit differently than yours does. So for me to say, like, no, you got to do these toy games, I had to suffer through them and now you have to suffer through them too. Right? Like, maybe your brain just works differently than mine does, and you're not going to connect with toy games in the same way that I do. So I'm trying to write in a way that's going to connect, and in some cases, or in many cases, explain the same thing in multiple ways, so that different types of people with different ways of learning or different ways of understanding things, or even the same person. I think you benefit from thinking about the same thing in different sorts of ways. So yeah, I'm trying to think about how can I present the same ideas in several different ways.
Incredible. So when do you expect the book to be finished?
I would like it to be finished a little bit earlier than Play Optimal Poker came out last year. So
yeah, which you were doing like on the plane to Vegas for the World Series. You were like final.
I missed a few early, not actual WSOP events, but like stuff at the Venetian that I would have otherwise played. I ended up skipping in order to get the book finished, and that didn't feel great. And there was a few things that got a little bit rushed towards the end, mostly with regard to like formatting. So I would like to have it finished more like mid-May or something, so that's kind of like definitively out before the series starts, rather than down to the wire. And I think that's feasible. I think a lot of what happened last year was just I didn't appreciate how long certain things were going to take. Maybe you heard the hatred in my voice when I said formatting.
Yeah, you didn't sound like you're a fan of formatting.
It takes a long time, and it's not why I wrote. Like, writing takes a long time also, but like I knew, like, I'm good at writing, I like writing, and I knew that's what I was signing up for when I said I want to write a book. Okay, you're gonna have to write. I wasn't necessarily thinking about how much was going to go into creating, chapter headings or like things along those lines. You kind of round that to zero in your head, and then when you actually sit down to do it, you're like, oh, this is not at all zero.
So you are living in Maryland again, but you are in Atlantic City right now. Tell everybody why you're there.
They decided to have a poker tournament here, and I kind of don't like. I just feel like people are so miserable at the Borgata. I mean, I've played here a number of times, and I feel like it's just one of the more like unpleasant places that I play poker for a variety of. And some of this is like my own hangups and like the sort of person that I am, and I don't feel like I really mix well with the like stereotypical New Yorker kind of alpha person. So some of it is just personality clash. I don't necessarily mean to blame other people, but anyway. I was a little like, I mean, I know it's close and it is a good event, but I just don't really enjoy playing there. But then I was at Maryland Live, so we're recording this now on Monday. I played my day 1A yesterday, Sunday. I was at Maryland Live on Friday night, and everyone I was playing was kind of like, oh, so they're talking about their plans for going up for the Borgata, and they're asking me if I'm going to go or when I'm going to go. And after about the 20th person asked me, like the fear of missing out kind of took over, and I was like, I guess I'm going to Borgata. And so I drove up here Sunday morning, and it was fine actually. Like people, I mean, they're strong personalities, which I do generally enjoy. I didn't really have my stereotypes about Borgata players did not entirely play out on day 1A, and maybe it was just that I ran bad last year and I'm running better so far this year.
That definitely affects my mood, whether I like to admit it or not.
Oh, you know what I meant to say a while ago? And I'm curious if so you mentioned sleep or feeling like your B game or you're being grumpy even was often related to not getting enough sleep. One of the things that I did last year after the main event, I spent some time with my cousin and her 4-year-old daughter, and we had done the same thing last year when the daughter was 3. And it's so striking to see how her personality changes once it gets to be like an hour or so from her bedtime, and she's like starting to get pretty tired, and she just turns into a total bitch. Like it's like we generally have like a great relationship, and she really likes me, and then she'll just get like mean as hell all of a sudden, just like an hour before her bedtime, and you can see so clearly what's happening with her, but to the point where I have to say to myself like that's probably happening to me too. Like I'm an adult and I'm a little better at like hiding it or coping with it, but like we're still like our brains are basically the same. I mean, I think I'm probably affected by being short on sleep in the same way that she is, or being tired in the same way that she is. It's just more clear to see it with her because it's so like night and day, and she doesn't even bother to try to hide it. She's like, I'm not happy now.
Right. She hasn't had to learn the skill yet of being civil to people when she doesn't want to.
Yes, that's right. But it made me think that I like the same thing is probably going on with in a way that I had not really like considered before.
Yeah, we're basically all a bunch of toddlers when you boil it down.
Yeah, I think like our desire to sort of draw these distinctions between like that's what children do and this is what adults do. I think a lot of that is overrated, and I think poker demonstrates that to us in a lot of different ways. But sleep, it just occurred to me that was something I meant to say when you were talking about sleep way back when.
When you decided to go to Borgata, you tweeted a grumpy a grumpy tweet. It was like, okay, fine, I'll go to Borgata.
Well, that was partly for the benefit of all those Maryland poker players who I was told the like 2 nights before that I wasn't going to go, and then I knew I was going to like see a bunch of them there. So I thought it would be handy if I put it on Twitter. At least some of them would see that in advance, and I wouldn't have to be like, hey, I thought you said you weren't going.
Well, the FOMO is strong. So you played day 1A yesterday. Do you have any hands that you want to?
Yeah, I have, I guess, two good ones. So we're at the 200, 300, 300 level, and I have King Jack offsuit in the low jack. So I think this is a pretty clear open. I open to 800. And the small blind and the big blind both call me, and the small blind makes this like really aggressive call. Like he like slams the chips into the pot when he calls. And he was like the most New Yorky person that I played with. But even so, like this was still a little uncharacteristic. Like he didn't put money into the pot this way every single time. So I'm just curious, like right off the bat, how do you interpret something like when you see someone kind of like really aggressively put chips in the pot with no other information about the person. Like, how would you interpret that kind of behavior?
Well, generally, when I see that, I would assume that they're getting sick of me raising so much.
That was definitely not the case here. I had not been. I mean, first off, I had only been at the table like
Okay.
less than an hour, and I had
So,
not been like raising.
okay, because sometimes you get that sort of defiant, like aggressive
Yes.
call, like you can't bluff me. Otherwise, I'm not really sure how I would interpret that, not actually seeing the physical behavior in person. I'm not sure. What did you make of it?
I mean, kind of that same thing. Not necessarily that it was directed at me personally, but just that it like I tend to think of it as behavior that's designed to discourage action a little bit. And it's weird. I mean, you don't tend to see that so much pre-flop because pre-flop you don't typically know yet whether you have a marginal hand. It's more like, you flop middle pair or you have top pair with a bad kicker and you're facing a big bet on the turn. And sometimes you'll see people like really like aggressively put chips in the pot because they want to sort of deter you from betting again on the next street. I think it's rare, like pre-flop, it's kind of weird to see that behavior because people don't usually know yet whether they want you to bet the flop. Like they have to see the flop first, in a way that like they often do know that on the once we get past the flop. So I wasn't really sure what to make of the fact that it was happening in a pre-flop context, but that's how I tend to interpret it post-flop.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, it's instead of it's classic strong means weak, right? I mean, when you boil it
Yeah,
down, is I don't
exactly.
want you to keep betting because I'm not that strong. So I'm going to act really strong in hopes that that will trick you.
Exactly. And the
Yeah.
funny thing is sometimes people like I don't it's generally not a good idea to like give away the contents of your hand to your opponent. Like, they deal the cards face down for a reason. But you often see this from people who will then call the next bet. Like they're sort of hoping that you don't bet, but they will still call because they also don't want to get bluffed. At which point they shouldn't really be trying to deter you from betting because they're not going to deter you from betting your nutty hands. The only thing they're going to deter you from is bluffing. So like if they're going to call anyway, they shouldn't be trying to deter you from bluffing. But that's neither here nor there.
Well, that aggressive style behavior that you'll find so often at the Borgata is not usually the result of complex thought about about how you'll interpret. It's just I'm a tough guy, so I act like a tough guy.
Right. Fair
So
enough.
there you go. I tend to agree generally with your views on the Borgata, but I have so many good memories there. I sort of enjoy playing with the tough guys because to me, it's like growing up in Baltimore. I just sort of equate the typical Borgata player to the typical Yankee fan. So when I win there, I feel like I beat the Yankees, which feels good. All right, so you raise with King Jack offsuit from middle position and get called by the blinds, the small blind in a particularly aggressive way.
Correct. So we get a Queen 10 for rainbow flop. Pretty nice for a King Jack offsuit. I've got 8 clean outs to the nuts. A king could be good. I mean, outside chance, I already have the best hand. Who knows? Small blind checks, and the big blind bets 11 into a pot of 2,700. And I mean, he was new to the table, but he had a very recreational look to him. So my general inclination, at least, I mean, I don't want to say that like donk bets are always weak. I think it's pretty contextual, but this is not a situation where I tend to expect that sort of player to lead with like a set. I think much more like this is very frequently a like probing kind of bet from this kind of player is how I'm inclined to interpret that. Does that ring true to you?
For sure. We've been talking a lot on this podcast actually about donk betting and about how that supercomputer figured out that none of us are donk betting enough. And so I've been trying to figure out how to work more donk bets into my game. Generally, it's a draw or a weak hand, is especially from a weaker player. That's what I would agree with your assessment that it's probably not like top two or a set because they almost always would check those hands over to the razor. Also, the sizing is kind of smallish, which weak players don't tend to bet very small with their stronger hands. And third, it's a rainbow flop, so he doesn't have a flush draw. So that means it's probably a very weak, maybe bottom pair, something like that. That's what I would guess, or maybe even nothing at all.
Yeah, that was kind of my read as well. I will say, just in terms of donk betting in general, this we can give you a little preview from Play Optimal Poker too. In heads up pots, I would mostly not worry about it. There's not a lot of situations in heads up pots, especially on the flop, where donk betting does much to add to your EV. Even in a situation where a solver might do it frequently, like if you give a solver the option, it might donk bet as much as like 20 or 30% of its range in some situations, but it rarely does all that much to contribute to your EV. So I think there's generally much more important things to worry about. I wouldn't fret too much about your donk betting range in heads up pots. In multi-way pots, it's more complicated.
Right. So, but do you know about that new computer, Pluribus, I think it's called?
Yes, I have looked some at but I think that's like mostly for multi-way.
Multi-way pots, yeah. So situations like this
the
one.
exciting bits playing well in multi-way pots in a way that AIs typically have not.
Right, right. So yeah, but that's for another day. So given your read that the big blind at least is weak, should we raise here or just call with our draw to the nuts?
I want to raise, and in large part, I want to raise because it's a multi-way pot. Like, if in a heads-up pot, there could be a case for just calling because his weak doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to fold. But yeah, so like in a multi-way pot, I think my chances of stealing the pot are much improved because I think it's a pretty tricky spot for the small blind. Even if he has a queen, if the action goes bet raise before it's back on him and he has, say, queen jack suited, or king queen, like that's kind of a tough spot for him to play. I mean, I think he probably calls, but he's not feeling good about it when that's the action in front of him. So I did want to raise here. In part because it was a multi-way pot, and importantly because I do have a really clean draw to the nut. So I don't want people's takeaway from this to be just always raise donk bets. I think that's like much too simplistic. I think it matters a lot what your cards are, but in a situation where I have a hand that could very plausibly improve to the point where I'm very where I want to play for stacks, starting to build the pot immediately on the flop is nice. And now if I had a much weaker draw, if I had, say, like 9-8 without a backdoor flush draw, I might be less inclined to raise the flop because then even if I do improve my hand, I still might not be looking to play a real big pot with it because there would be better straights possible or something like that. So I don't want to give people the impression to be raising here like willy-nilly. I think you need more information than just like, oh, this guy donked, he's probably weak, before you decide to go for it with any two cards. So it's important that I don't have any two cards here. I have an 8-out draw to the nuts.
Right. Now, what are the stacks here? Effective like 40, 45, something like that?
Yeah, starting stack was 40. I had 36. I think both of these players covered me. 120 big blinds deep to start the hand. We're still quite deep, very high stack to pot ratio.
Okay. So what will you do if you get 3-bet here, having raised?
I'm almost certainly calling. I don't think this is a player who's really going to be folding to a shove after he 3-bets. I mean, I guess I would try to get a feel for that because my hand is a very nice one to jam as a semi bluff since it has so many outs. I just think exploitably, this is not a player that I would ever expect to have fold equity against when I shove. So I would likely call and just hope to turn the nuts. But importantly, I just don't think it's going to happen very often. I think even if he has a strong hand, he may not 3-bet it. A lot of players won't. A lot of players will just call here even if they did lead out with a set, and then I certainly don't think he's going to 3-bet if he just has, middle pair or even top pair. I think you tend not to see this player 3-bet that into an uncapped, like on the preflop raise, or I could have aces or something.
Right, but what about the tough guy?
I had not factored him a whole lot into the hand. I mean, I think it's pretty tough for him. I guess he also did not seem like a professional player. So I didn't really give him credit for just like randomly 3-betting light. If he were to 3-bet, I think I just think he like has to have top 2 or better to 3-bet here, which he's just not going to have very often. So that was more of a like, I'll cross that bridge when I come to it.
Right, because
it's a factor. It definitely reduces the profitability of my raise a little bit that he could be sitting back there with one of those hands, but I just don't think it's that likely.
Okay. Yeah, I would generally call in this situation. I think I don't want to chase the small blind out. So when the big blind bets 1100, I would usually call. I'm getting a decent price to draw to my 8 outs. And then also I might get called by the small blind as well. And then when I do make the nuts, I can possibly win a bigger pot from both of them.
I like how you just say when I make the nuts as if that's a foregone conclusion.
I'm an optimist, I always make the nuts. I mean, how did I make all this money?
Yeah, I mean that's like the main I would say I don't want the small blind coming along because it's going to be much harder to steal the spot from two people. I'm really treating the draw, and I generally treat draws more as like backup plans, where it's like, well, if my bluff doesn't work, I've always got that draw to fall back on. So my first question when I have a strong draw is always, do I think I can win this pot without going to showdown? And if I think the answer is yes, that's usually what I'm going to try to do. So that's what I was going for here, and I think that your prospects for doing that are much better if you can get the pot heads up than if you, because like if I can get small blind to fold a 10, or I don't even think it's that implausible I get him to fold a queen, or if he does, maybe he peels the flop with a queen and then he folds a later street. I just think it's much easier for me to much more, like, people are going to more plausibly believe that I am strong if I raise the flop than if I call and then try to bluff later. And I also think like getting the small blind out is a good thing, I would say.
Makes sense. So what happens on 4th Street? Oh wait, we're still doing the flop.
Yeah, so the small blind did not fold, but he also didn't three bet, which is the small blind cold called my raise and the big blind folded. So big blind.
Okay, so I don't know what's happening now.
Yeah, big blind leads out for 1,100. I make it 3,000. Small blind
cold
calls, and then big blind folds. Like it folds pretty quickly. Like I think we were right that he just didn't have much of anything.
Yeah, he was just taking a random stab at a pot that had 2 Broadway cards in it. So
Right.
That's weird. All right. Okay, so now we're down to heads up. Anyway, it's just not the heads up we thought we might get down to.
Right. And the turn is an 8. So the board now is Queen 10 for 8. I don't remember whether it put out a flush draw, but it wasn't particularly relevant. I mean, I have a blocker to Jack 9 for whatever that's worth, which would now be the nuts. But small blind, like, very quickly and once again aggressively, like, kind of similar like chip slamming sort of behavior. He bets out 6,000. So at this point, there's like 8,700 in the pot, I think 8,800 in the pot, and he leads out for 6,000, and we've got like 36k or like a 42k in my stack, so 6 plus another 36. So I think my options now are either call or shove. I don't think there's really a case for raising. I mean, I think it's going to be hard. Like if I raise less than either, I'm calling a shove, at which point I'd rather just shove myself, or I'm folding to a shove where I'm folding away a good amount of equity. I don't really like that. So I think if I'm raising, it's going to be all in.
Okay. Well, now against players like the one you're describing, generally for me, when I see a large bet, like 6,000 here is a pretty serious bet for the pot size and everything else. And especially when it just comes out of nowhere. So now here we have a situation where you raised pre-flop and then another guy donk led the flop, and then you raise that, and now a third guy is now showing aggression here on the turn. All right, so this is a weird hand. Everybody who's had a chance to be aggressive has done so at some point in this hand. So I would interpret this bet, even though he's doing that aggressive action and behavior, the more important information is that a large bet has been made. So I would probably interpret this as a relatively strong hand, maybe something like a top pair, ace queen, king queen, something like that.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of boiling it down. That was kind of my read in the situation too, especially with the sort of aggressive behavior. Also, I kind of thought it was like, just like a good top pair where he didn't want to fold it to the flop bet, but he wasn't happy about the fact that I raised, and now there's some draws on the board. He kind of just wants me to go away. I think that's something you see from record, like something they just want, like you were saying before. A lot of people don't always have like a strong plan for the hand. They just sort of want you to go over and want it to be away so they can take the chips. That was kind of what I felt like was going on here, where like he did have a pretty good hand, but I wasn't sure it was good enough to call a shove. Like, is he calling a shove with ace queen? I don't know.
I think this player would have a tough decision with ace queen, but I think eventually he would call. So yeah, we'll never know. But yeah, that's not the hand you're trying to bluff somebody off of, right? Ace queen.
I don't know. I mean, when we're this deep, like it kind of is. I mean, I did not shove. What's worth. I ultimately arrived at the same conclusion that he was showing sufficient strength that I decided I was just gonna like jam into him. But I don't think it's unreasonable to try to get ace queen in this situation. Like people, especially like this is a guy I've seen around the Borgata before. I think he's pretty comfortable with the amount of money that's involved. If this were someone that I thought were a more like skittish recreational player, like someone maybe who satellited in, I think it's very plausible to believe like in level 3 of the tournament that I think those people, like a lot of those people, just have a mentality they don't want to go broke in level 3 of the tournament. Technically, he covered me, but he had like 1,000 left if he lost this pot. Like he was basically out if he lost this pot. So, yeah, I wasn't super. I don't think it's that.
I would say as a general point, trying to get tough guys to lay down top pair, top kicker at the Borgata is probably not a winning strategy.
Yeah, fair enough.
In general, especially when these players come out of left field and put 6K into 8K on the turn. Right. Not saying it would never work, but there are easier ways to make money in New Jersey.
Well, I chose the easiest one, which is calling in.
Oh, good for you. So the ace on the river?
Ace on the river peels off, and he now bets 12,000, leaving 24,000 behind. I don't think there's any play other than shoving. I could raising. So I shove, and he like just beats me into the pot with his pocket queens, which I'm probably never shoving a hand worse than queens for value here, for whatever that's worth. But he can't wait to get it in with his queens, and then was very upset and said that he should have just shoved the turn, which I don't agree with. But that's I do think he should have 3-bet the flop. As we said, like I do think I think he shot the flop. But
so we misread all of his behavior pre-flop, where he was sort of aggressively putting his chips in, and we thought it was kind of a weak.
I don't know what pre-flop was about. Maybe he was just like upset about not 3-betting or something. Like he kind of felt like he should 3-bet, but then he didn't. So then he was sort of upset about himself for not 3-betting it, or I don't know. Like that was part of why I didn't really consider him having queens, is I thought he would have 3-bet that pre-flop, and I don't know if that was related to his aggression was related to not 3-betting it, like his aggressive behavior, but not as aggressive betting, was related to sort of frustration with himself for not 3-betting it or something.
Right. Well, that's okay. Well, I mean, that's pretty good that you made the nuts against a flop top set. That's probably the best strategy if you can just make the nuts and then go all in. So I hope that's in your new book.
Well, I mean, playing draws to the nuts aggressively, I think, that is in the book, and I think that's an important principle, like especially when you're deep, when you are choosing hands to bluff with, you do want to be choosing hands that if you get there, they will be nutty. Like it's not entirely a coincidence that I had the nuts at a time when the pot was large, and also like playing the nuts aggressively when you have them. So like from his perspective, I think it was not a good time to get trappy with queens for a variety of reasons. But I think like he would have benefited from 3-betting queens pre-flop. I think he would have benefited from 3-betting queens on the flop. And one thing that I've picked up from working with solvers and that I do try to underline in my book is how rarely solvers slow play the nuttiest hands. When they do slow play, it's often hands that are not quite so nutty. So like it's pretty rare actually that you see a solver slow play quads, even though like humans instinctively like tend to do it a lot. If the flop is like 10-10-6, it's not that common that or even more so if it's 10-6-6, like it's not that common that you're going to see a solver slow play sixes for a variety of, but I think assuming you're deep enough that like you need to make multiple bets to get money into the pot, I do think like people slow play way too much, and that's one lesson of this hand.
Interesting. So let's go back to on the flop. I said, how would you react if he 3-bet your flop raise, and you said you would probably call. So yeah, I mean, I guess, and then he could shove the turn, and I think you would have had to fold.
Yeah, I would have, and I don't necessarily mean to. We should replay this hand and think about how could he have won it in retrospect, knowing that I have King Jack off. I think there's a variety of like, I mean, 3-betting the flop is also the best play if I have aces. Like if I have aces, I'm checking behind the turn after he cold calls the flop raise. Like especially when an 8 peels off, and now like any Jack 9 he has got there. There's too much that I'm losing to. I'm going to pot control if I have aces. And when you're out of position and you slow play, people think that they're being trappy and giving their opponents the opportunity to bluff, which I suppose they are, but they're also giving their opponents the opportunity to slow play, which is really bad for you when you have, or not to slow, but the opportunity to pot control, which is really bad for you when you have a nutty hand. You don't want your opponent to pot control. So when you're out of position, especially, and you're slow playing, what you're really doing is allowing your opponent to pot control. And one of the reasons why he should be 3 free betting the flop is so that I can't just pot control if I have pocket kings or pocket aces.
That, to me, that's the key. When you have the nuts, it's in your best interest to try to increase the amount of the pot. So the slow play is, yeah, it's interesting to me that the solvers don't do it. Especially, I think every time I've ever flopped quads, I probably slow played it.
Yeah, I mean, it does depend on the board texture. I think you would probably see it more often if there's like two aces on the board, for instance. Like it kind of depends on how important it is that you're blocking trips in your opponent's range. When the board is like 10-6-6, there's probably not a lot of six in your opponent's range anyway. So the fact that you're blocking trips just doesn't do that much to really block his call. Like a lot of the hands you should be putting money into the pot with on a 10-6-6 board, are like 10x, gut shots, backdoor flush draws, overcards, overpairs, pocket pairs. Like you're not blocking any of that stuff when you have quads. If the board is like ace 10, then ace x would be a much bigger part of your opponent's range for putting money into that pot, and you might see more slow playing because you are blocking more of the hands that are going to give you action. But I think especially when the quads are like not particularly large cards, the fact that you have quads is really not doing that much to like block your opponent's giving action range.
Excellent. Just amazing. And I've been hyping, I guess is the best way to say it, your series of reviewing every hand that you played on your way to a 125th place finish in the most recent World Series of Poker main event. I'm obsessed with this series. You go through each hand, your thought process. You go back and say, I made a mistake in this hand. I like what I did here. I wish I could have done this again. Very honest, kind of talking us through how you did what you did. It's not easy to make it that far in the main event, and that was a really great series.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask you what else you're working on. Do you have any new stuff coming out for TPE members?
The one that I literally just finished recording last week is, I think this is a popular format with TPE people. So this is a member hand history review of, I think it's a $27 tournament. So I think it's more, I know people like enjoy getting the main event coverage, and we do have TPE members who play the main event. But I think, a lot of people, when they listen to, like the hand we just talked about, for instance, I think it's easy for people to listen to that and just sort of dismiss it and say, well, that maybe that works in 10Ks, but that doesn't work in $27 tournaments. And some of that is true. I think sometimes that's just lazy thinking where, I think like my thought process is not wildly different in $27 tournaments as it is in 10Ks. But in any event, like I know that it's good to produce content that's more at the stakes that a lot of our members are playing at. So, and I don't play a lot of $27 tournaments myself, but I do. So I did a hand history review for a TPE member, and so people can see my thoughts on how they ought to be playing in like smaller stakes online tournaments. Which, I mean, there's more opportunities for exploitation, but the same principles apply. Like you still should be thinking about board coverage. You should be bluffing more often when you have blockers. Like all that stuff is still relevant at smaller stakes. But I like that format because I know that is more immediately accessible for a lot of our member base. So I'm excited to have that coming out. And then, the reason that I was able to give you such detailed hand histories from these two hands is that I am taking very good notes in this Borgata event. We're still a long way from the money, let alone a deep run in it. But, should that happen, I have notes on lots of hands that I played. This could turn into another, how I ran deep in a big live event series. Those have been certainly a lot of fun for me to like review some of the most exciting poker that I've played, and I think those are popular with members as well. So here's hoping that I get to put together a how I won the WPT Borgata video for Tournament Poker Edge.
That would be amazing. I hope you do it, buddy. You've done your homework. You deserve it. If anyone deserves anything in poker,
I was going to say, if there were such a thing as deserve, you might be right. But
there's just no justice. Yeah. So as we are recording this only after you've only played your first day, here's hoping that there are many, many more days and many, many more hands to discuss. So, Andrew, thank you so much for being here. And for Andrew Brokos, author of Play Optimal Poker, at Thinking Poker on Twitter. And for everyone here at Tournament Poker Edge, I'm Clayton Fletcher. Thank you so much for listening.
I wanna hold them like they do in Texas plays. Fold them, let them hit me, raise reason, baby, stay with me. Luck and intuition, play the cards with babes to start. And after she's been hooked, I'll play the one that's on her heart. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. I'll get her heart, show her what I got. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. I'll get her heart, show her what I got. Can't read mine, no, she can't read a mile. Poker face, she's got to love nobody. Can't read mine, no, she can't read a mile. Poker face, she's got to love nobody. Poker face, poker face. Poker face, poker face. I wanna roll with her, a hard pair we will be. While little gambling is fun when you're with me. I love it. Russian roulette is not the same without a gun. And baby, when it's love, it's not rough, it isn't fun. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. I'll get her heart, show her what I got. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. I'll get her heart, show her what I got. Can't read mine, no, she can't read a mile. Poker face, she's got to love nobody. Can't read mine, no, she can't read a mile. Poker face, she's got to love nobody. Poker face, poker face. Poker face, poker face. Can't read mine, no, she can't read a mile. Poker face, she's got to love nobody. Can't read mine, no, she can't read a mile.